Good afternoon, everyone. Live from Zurich, Switzerland. Thank you for joining in the call. This is the second webinar in the series, Lessons for Leaders from the Pandemic Crisis. We have the topic specifically is a new leadership focus, positivity and well-being as drivers of change. Positivity and well-being as drivers of change. So we're live from the Zurich campus. You see behind me, it's empty, of course. The students are not here. We're not allowed to host any students anywhere, just like you in your country. But we're hosting this from the campus today. I'd like to mention before, often we get in the rush of things and we hear the speakers and we get into a Q&A, and we forget that we've got some things going. This is a part of a series. So first, I'd like to say my name is Rob Straub. I am the president and the CEO of CEIBS Switzerland, based in Zurich, part of CEIBS based in Shanghai. The two webinars, the next webinar in the series that you can see on your screen is in partnership with GDI, which is the Gottlieb Duttweiler Institute. It's a think tank based here in Switzerland. And the topic will be consumer behavior in a crisis. So one of our professors, Professor Jungwon Jun, and the CEO of GDI, David Bossart, will be both panelists next week. You can see the web address at the bottom of the screen. You can click on that, and if it doesn't work, we'll make sure that we send this to you as a follow-up to the webinar. The second thing I'd like to mention is a program called Leading at the Edge. It's a new leadership development journey program taught by our own Professor Catherine Shin, who indicated she would also be on the call today, together with Professor George Kohlrieser, who is a Professor Emeritus from IMD. Professor George Kohlrieser has been also working with us at CEIBS for many, many years. We'll be offering this both in January and in June, this new intensive leadership journey program. We'll be forwarding you the information about both of these after the event today. So what do we have in store? We have, first of all, we're going to have Professor Emily David talk about the science of a leader, well-being, the science of a leader well-being, and then following her, we're going to be talking about positivity as a driver of connection and creativity. Positivity as a driver of connection and creativity. After that, we're going to have some experience sharing. On these series, what we've done is we asked two people in advance to give specific comments on them. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And then we'll have some Q&A. We've got a lot of people on the call now. We've got 105 people on the call. And we'll answer some of the Q&A. Last time we were able to even go after the fact and answer some of the questions offline and get them back to you. So we hope to be finished right about 2 o'clock. Yeah, so if you've got questions, use the Q&A box at the bottom. And Hannah, who's working with me here, setting this up. Thank you, Hannah, very much for all this. We might have to interject and ask things from her, and also ask for pollings to come up because we've got some pollings. And speaking of pollings, before we start, I'd like to ask you a question and start our first poll to keep this interactive. Where are you? So last time we saw that we had people, over 200 people from 26 different countries. So where are you? Just click on there, and we're going to keep going on this for a little bit to find out where our participants are coming from. So obviously it's very early morning in North America and South America. We've set this up so that primarily Europeans and Africans and Asians can be on these webinars. Thanks for the chats coming in, Rhino. So Europe looks at 25%, a lot from Africa, 52 right now. And Asia at about 20%. This is fantastic. And 2% coming in from Rob Webb in Abu Dhabi. Hi, Rob. Welcome. Thank you. For a couple more seconds, and I'm going to close the poll. Have you all voted? Okay, so Can you see the sharing of the where the participants are coming from? Hannah? Yep. Can you see it? Yes? Okay, great. So Africa wins the poll. I'd like to see more Asians and more Europeans and especially more North Americans attend next time. So this is the kind of interaction we want. Now I'd like to give the word directly over to Professor Emily David. She is an assistant professor of management. Her focus is organizational behavior. Emily, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Robert. Thank you guys so much for coming out at all times of the day and night. I was especially excited to see in the participants list all my Wella ladies, so shout out to you guys. I know I can't hear you, but I would imagine that you're probably shouting. So thank you guys for tuning in. And I'm really honored to be here today to talk about this topic, which I think is so important. And it's something that we can use right now during the COVID-19 pandemic. And hopefully, I think you also take away a few lessons that you can apply to your life going forward. So as Robert mentioned, we're going to be talking a lot about the science of well-being, of positivity, of emotions. And my part of the talk today is really going to be focusing on the science of the internal things that the leader has to go through. So basically, how can the leader make sure that they're conveying the right emotions? How can they make sure that they're regulating their emotions in a way that can keep them in the most productive way, particularly in these huge times of stress? Okay, so sorry about that. Um,
Emily, you're based in Shanghai, correct?
I am, yeah. So
Great.
that's why you can see it's a little dark outside. So I'm here in Shanghai and like you guys, social distancing, but things are getting back to normal. So there is kind of hope on the other end of some of these things and shutdowns that we're seeing around the world. So there's your first dose of positivity for today. So even whenever we're considering this topic, before we had the added stress of social isolation and these rapidly increasing counts of confirmed cases and deaths every day, we know from decades of research that stress and burnout is a really huge problem in our organizations. So we know, for example, that 25% of people report feeling that they're burned out all the time or most of the time. And it's a growing problem as we see that, roughly 2 times the people compared to 20 years ago report being all the time exhausted. And this is an issue not just for productivity reasons, but also we see that things like chronic stress are related to depression, alcohol abuse, memory loss, sleep problems, weakened immune systems, cardiovascular disease. I'm starting to sound a little bit like the tail end of a pharmaceutical commercial, but we do know that it has a huge impact, which can translate into really big expenditures for organizations and for whole economies, upwards of $500 billion in the US alone. So the question is, what can we do about this, particularly in these times whenever we see that stress is being mounted onto the normal stress that we typically are dealing with in organizations? And so the good news is that we don't just have a lot of science saying that burnout is a bad thing, but we also have decades of research showing that there are things you can do to really mitigate some of these effects of stress and burnout. And the first thing that I kind of want to take issue with is this kind of little voice in your head, or this common conception that we have in society, that we have to sacrifice our short-term happiness, our short-term well-being for the greater good, or even to be successful down the road. Right, so often we think we have to sacrifice now. We have to, kind of pull the all-nighters so that we can hopefully be happy and productive, once we retire. But a lot of modern research is really challenging this. And you see on the screen here a Stanford researcher, her name is Emma Sapala, and she's one of the people that really has been leveraging science to show that, if you deplete yourself, both in a physiological and in a mental way, kind of going along with the maxims like the captain must go down with the ship, this is really going to end up with much worse outcomes. And so instead, we really need to have a back to basics kind of thing, reminding ourselves to sleep, exercise, eat well, which we so easily forego whenever we're facing extreme stress or we have a lot of uncertainty in our lives. And even before the crisis hit, we know a survey from Better Up reported that 14% of people reported poor sleep quality. 21% were less active than they had been in the past. So we know that people are struggling with these kinds of things. But it's important to kind of keep in touch with this and to kind of monitor yourself because when we're running physiologically low on energy, we tend to do things like lean more on our biases and on our stereotypes, and we consider fewer different points of view when we're making decisions, which we know can be a bad thing. But beyond these kind of basics, what else can we do to make sure that as a leader, we're protecting our own well-being so that we can then make good decisions and support our employees going forward? And if I had to summarize, I didn't want to spend too much time on this, but if I had to summarize what the research says about safeguarding our well-being, it really comes down to the acronym of PERMA. Okay, so PERMA means that you really need to stand up and care about increasing your positive emotions, increasing your engagement, fostering better relationships, increasing the meaning in your life, and having periodical accomplishment episodes. Okay, so these five kind of pillars of well-being, if you will, are some ways that you can kind of make sure that you're mentally and physically on track so that way you can deal with crises like the one that we're facing. One good practice for engagement, for example, we know a scholar, a German scholar, Sabine Sonnentag, she's really famous for talking about what are called recovery episodes, which basically means psychologically distancing yourself from work, right? So this can be vacations in normal times, but even small things like hobbies and breaks. So this can have a huge impact. In one hospital where we implemented breaks in the kind of afternoon slump, they saw an 18% decline in mortality rates. So we know that kind of taking a moment to harness this time and use it in a productive way can be really helpful. And science is also helpful to tell us how we can take smart breaks or how we can kind of increase the effectiveness of these kind of pauses in our day-to-day work. Some things that we know work, social is better than solo. We know that active breaks are a lot better than passive breaks, okay? So you wanna do things like conversations or exercise and try and prioritize those over things like flipping through your phone or even, yes, binge watching on Netflix, The Tiger King, all right? This is not gonna be quite as restorative for your energy. We also know from the research that nature and greenery really are helpful here. Even adding an office plant in one study boosted well-being and also productivity by 15%. Okay, and even if a lot of this seems familiar, you know, you're like, okay, of course I know that as the leader I need to take care of my well-being. There's nothing much new here, but I would be willing to bet that if I, you know, kind of pushed a lot of you to the wire and asked how many times in the past week have you felt grateful for something, or how many times in the past week have you had this feeling of accomplishment? It certainly wouldn't be on the top of your head, and maybe you know, you couldn't even recall it if you tried. So in many ways, what the studies show is that the best way to safeguard against burnout and to increase your engagement, particularly in high stress times, is to keep track of all these different PERMA episodes that you experience on a daily or on a weekly basis. And we see that there's a lot of tools out there to help with this. You may have read that a professor in Yale, Laurie Santos, she's offering a free course on the science of happiness on Coursera. And they even made a companion app to go with this. It's called Rewhy. And it's really cool. You can tap and just like any kind of monitoring software, you can keep track of all these different episodes. So that way they're much more at the forefront of your mind and that you're able to more capitalize on this psychological detachment. Okay, and there's a lot of There's also a lot of research that shows that this is particularly important in the COVID-19 crisis as we're facing it. So some research that comes from our CEIBS very own professor, Professor Michelle Zhang, she's actually from Wuhan, and she wanted to see if all these little slivers of time that we're able to kind of reclaim back when we would normally be getting dressed for work or when we would normally be recruiting or commuting to the office, how can we best use that time? Right? How can we use that time to help kind of bolster against some of that stress that we're facing because of the crisis? And so the experiment that she designed was actually conducted in Wuhan with people who were in the original lockdown whenever this virus was still very much an unknown. And she wanted to see, first of all, how these daily counts that all of us wake up to read in terms of new confirmed cases in our country or in our state, the new deaths that we see, kind of ticking upwards every day. Clearly, these are a stressor, but how can we use these different practices of well-being to kind of push against that stress a little bit? And so for half of the people, what she did is she said, okay, for 10 minutes every morning for 10 days, I want you to engage in mindfulness activities, right? So bring some of these PERMA experiences to the front of your mind. And for the other half of the participants, what she did is she said, just let your mind wander freely. Let it think about whatever you want it to think about. And she found some really cool results from this. All right, so from the first graph, you can see here that even though in general people lost sleep whenever they had, for every 1,000 cases, kind of announced in the news that they had new confirmed cases or new deaths, people were negatively impacted by that. But if they were in the mindfulness condition, they use that break in their time to really be, thankful and to be savoring, and a lot of these other episodes that Lisa's going to share with you, it actually didn't affect their sleep at all. Whereas for the people who let their mind wander, every 1,000 cases that were confirmed, they lost on average 39 minutes of sleep. And you can also see that it really helped with anxiety levels. So consistently over the 10 days, people who were in the mindfulness condition were really much better able to control that anxiety. And this builds on further evidence that we know from the literature that it can also help build your resilience, improve your relationships, help you to focus, and help you to emotionally regulate. Okay, so far I've really talked a lot about leaders and how you can safeguard your well-being so that way your energy can really be focused on the problems at hand and you can make better decisions that way. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time also talking to you about how you show these emotions to your followers and the impact that that can have from a leadership perspective. Okay, so basically, when we're talking about showing emotion to other people, we have 3 different options of how we do that. So we can, fake it, especially if it's a negative emotion. We can show a positive one instead. We can express our true emotions, and we can also reappraise our emotions. All right, and I'll take you through each one of those 3. Okay, so the first one, and the one that I think a lot of times we're advised to do, right? So, in a lot of these kind of helpful, webinars and articles about the COVID crisis, I see people telling others, don't let them see you sweat, right? Or hide your anxiety. But from a research standpoint, this is maybe not the best idea because we know that, number one, people who fake emotions have negative outcomes themselves, right? So they're more likely to burn out, they're more likely to want to quit. But also it has the other problem is that we're not very good at it. All right, so even if we're kind of the best actors in the world, we find that, for example, leaders who are suppressing anger, if you test the blood pressure of their followers, it's likely to rise. All right, and the interesting thing is that in most cases, the followers don't even consciously recognize that the person is angry because they do a good job of hiding it. But something about that inauthenticity really kind of registers with our body and it sends up some kind of a red flag, right? So based on that, you might think, all right, so the best thing to do is just be truthful, show your emotions as they come. But the problem with this is, especially in a crisis like this, if you go to your followers and you show them that you're scared, that you're angry, or these really extreme negative emotions, it can really increase their fear. It could destroy their confidence, and they kind of buckle up. And the reason that this happens is something called emotional contagion. So just like the virus, ironically enough, we can catch negative emotions from other people. All right, so what happens is if you have this outburst of anger, if you have this outburst of anxiety, people naturally, in an effort evolutionarily to kind of get along with others, we tend to mimic those actions, right? So if someone's kind of anxious and tense and kind of doing it, we tend to mirror that in our bodies, and then our head interprets it that these are the actual emotions that we're feeling. Right? So even things like burnout can be contagious. So we have studies that show down to the client level. So if teachers are burned out, for example, the students show elevated levels of the stress hormone cortisol. And unfortunately, social distancing doesn't even help guard against this kind of emotional contagion. They have studies that show that we can actually catch these negative emotions even online. So participants will match the emotional tone of YouTube vloggers, Facebook feeds, and the like. Okay, so then that leaves us with the third option, which is this idea of mentally reframing the situation. Okay, so you want to not fake, not show the real thing, but take a moment to pause and consider how the situation relates to the bigger picture, and to consider how it might be impacting your followers. Okay, and then the emotional expression following that reappraisal can be very different. You might realize that your followers don't need to see false positivity, but they also don't need to see an angry outburst. What they really need to see from you is kind of a cautious optimism or an encouragement. Okay, if you're having trouble, of course, this is easier said than done. One way to do this is to make yourself get there physiologically before you're able to get there mentally, right? So engaging in deep breathing exercises, doing the self-care things that we talked about a little bit ago. So that way you can be physically calmer, and then you can kind of get to a logical space in your brain where you can reframe the situation and look at it from a different angle. Okay, so taking our running example of the COVID-19 situation that we're all experiencing, you can really choose to look at this with doom and gloom, and certainly a lot of people are being negatively affected, and it is a very serious and very sad situation. But there's also ways that you can look at this with optimism and even see some silver linings or opportunities that might come out of it. So for example, just from a professional angle, if your employees are already experiencing so much change and having so much of their daily routines being appended, this might be a good time to do some other changes that you've been thinking about for a long time, right? So they're more open and more flexible, so you can take this to your advantage. Another thing is that you might see some cost savings going forward. You might see people not traveling as much or using shared office spaces, and that might lead to more inclusive work environments where people can more easily, since we're all more adept at kind of the technology side of things, they can more easily attend to their family responsibilities and manage chronic diseases, for example. And on a personal level, I think there are also some opportunities that are being presented by the distance, by the little bit of extra downtime. We can really take that time and reassess what's important to us, what our priorities are. And I hope that each one of you can go back to a normality where you're spending more time on the things that you find meaningful and impactful to others. Um, if for you it seems a little bit difficult, this idea of seeing it as an opportunity, at the very least, research would suggest that you should try and see it as not a threat, but a challenge. Okay, so even though those words are similar, we find that people who view problems as threats tend to shut down, they have increased stress levels, decreased performance, whereas seeing it as a challenge can help you concentrate better on the task at hand and more clearly see the steps needed to succeed. Okay, and there's some clear benefits that we see whenever you put in that extra effort to take a moment and pause and reappraise your situation. All right, so this is going to be a model from a study that I recently published. And what we found, we were looking at kind of the effects of all these different emotional regulation strategies and also how it related to leadership specifically. Okay, so we found that the people who were faking the emotions, unsurprisingly, didn't have any positive effects on their job attitudes or on their performance. People who expressed their natural emotions tended to be happier, right? Because they were able to align the inside and the outside. And finally, people who reframed the situation were much better able to kind of tailor it to the situation at hand, and thus were better performers. But the second part of this study that we were really interested in is how authentic leaders, or people who are really driven to be themselves and to show themselves to other people, how is this going to affect how they choose to express their emotions to others? Okay, and as you might expect, people who are driven to be authentic don't fake as much, and they tend to reveal more true emotions. So that's pretty straightforward. But the interesting thing is that we also found that authentic leaders were more likely to engage in these reframing kind of behaviors. And so that's kind of the last point that I wanted to leave you guys on, is that the whole point of this is that you do need to first and foremost safeguard your own well-being in these times. You also need to do a little bit of application of the science so you know how you can best leverage some of these well-being issues and also how you can best express the emotions that are arising to your followers. But what I don't want you to take away from this is that at all costs, you have to be positive all the time. And in particular, I don't think that you need to be positive whenever this is not normally your style, right? So if you're being positive or being optimistic and at the same time foregoing your authenticity as a leader, I think this might not be a good move, right? And so there's a lot more that we can talk about this, but I mean, in general, we're facing a situation that is unprecedented. The tolls on human life and the world economy are scary. People are angry, right? And I don't think communicating at least a little bit of this is a bad thing necessarily. And the interesting thing from a science point of view is that we do know that there are even some productive outcomes of even so-called negative emotions in the workplace, right? So at mild levels, we know that anger, for example, can help increase compliance, help people overcome barriers. Mild levels of fear and anxiety can help employees to be more vigilant. Mild levels of sadness can spur people to be more helpful and compassionate, and also can even help with your analytical ability. All right, so although we need to keep these negative emotions at bay for our well-being, and at extreme levels, they're never going to be productive, I think that authenticity is the core thing that you need to keep in mind. And I think a great example of this, I actually had 3 different students email me this same article about the Marriott CEO Arne Sorensen. And what the great thing about this video is that we see that, you know, he really took the time to reappraise the emotions, did everything right, appeared calm and confident, shared a plan going forward, turned the crisis into an opportunity. But he also did something else. And so especially right at the tail end of the video, he was especially vulnerable and even a little bit emotional. And so I think that, you know, being your true self, being open and transparent is going to build trust. And we know from the literature is going to really foster engagement in your employees, things like proactive behavior, and also more productivity. So I guess my big takeaway message here, don't forget about practicing self-care. You know, don't try and be a hero, because in the end of the day, it's just going to be counterproductive. Practice authentic leadership and measured levels, or putting boundaries in terms of your emotional expression, and also foster a workplace characterized by humanity. And this is going to help both you and your followers weather this storm as best you can. Okay, so that's it for the sharing that I have. And now we'll hear from Lisa Bevill about what are some of the outcomes of positive and negative emotions and why exactly this happens.
Great, thank you, Emily. Really interesting information. And I'm happy to build on that. I think we've coordinated quite well to talk about the science, which we know everyone wants the science. yet also to build in some practical ways to foster positivity to increase our well-being. So before we get there, we'd like to do just a couple of polls, and Hannah, if you could help me with those polls. We wanted to see how you're doing. So how is your well-being? How are you at this moment? So let's see, Hannah, I'm not seeing the poll. If I can help, I will. So our wellness check-in. On a scale of 1 to 5, how positive are you feeling today? So if you could just give us your input and see how things are going today, how positive are you feeling?
Lisa, can you see the poll?
I can see the poll. Can you see the poll?
Yeah, it's working great.
Great. Okay. And then our second question, if you want to scroll down, is on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is employee well-being in your company? So to understand you on a personal level today, how you're feeling. And in terms of well-being, employee well-being at your company, how important is that? Now, I'm guessing that this has probably changed in terms of employee well-being in this current environment we're living. I'll give you a few more moments. And what we'll talk about in a moment is trying to further understand and gain more granularity around emotions and the utility of emotions. And with that information, then how can we build upon creating more positive emotions? All right. So can you see the results there? Looks like it.
Yes.
So on a scale of 1 to 5, how positive are we feeling today? We're seeing the majority of people around a 4, and then followed by 3 and 5. So we see a very high level of positivity. So that's great. Typically, what we see in these types of webinars and with this focus, the people who are already in tune and inclined to positivity are the ones who attend. The ones that have their attention focused on a negativity are the ones who don't make the time for their own personal well-being and learning. So we're probably here in a situation, as they say in the US, preaching to the choir, but we'll dig in deeper as well. And then on a scale of 1 to 5, how important is well-being in your company? Great to see about 60% are saying that this is extremely important. I think this has taken a position at the forefront in terms of human well-being. How are we doing in this moment of crisis, and how we can all work together? And there, the role of the leader has really become prominent. And building on what Emily has been talking about, the well-being of the leader is critical because that emotional contagion is real. Okay, so I'm gonna, if we could close the poll, that would be great. And then let's carry on. So I'd like to go ahead and talk a little bit more about emotions and the science behind emotions. So here we have Barbara Fredrickson. She has really taken upon herself to study the utility of positive emotions. Now, we typically think about negative emotions, and we're very aware of those negative emotions. We're heightened to them. We understand the utility of negative emotions, that they help us personally survive. And that has evolved over the years, and we still have that heightened awareness and focus on negative emotions. This is what we call the negativity bias. It captures our attention to be focused on the negative. And when a pandemic that we're living in right now, like Emily was speaking about, we see the numbers, we see the overwhelming impact on human life, on economic wealth or the lack thereof, the diminishing impact, let's say, and we continue to focus on those negatives. That doesn't help us in terms of our long-term survival. It might help us in terms of our short-term survival in that fight or flight, but we want to get into a moment about what are what is the utility behind positive emotions. So before we get there, let's just take a look at an emotion, what it is. It's a signal to our bodies. And what we see there, this is probably similar to many graphs that we've seen. This one in particular is focusing on the quantity of emotions, negative emotions being red over time. And what we see there is we have an increased quantity of negative emotions, and then they decrease over time, whereas the positive is a flattened curve. It's positive emotions are much more like a whisper, where negative emotions are more of a shout. And so we have this negativity bias as humans. And then if we go into this focus on negative emotions capturing our attention, we're going to get into the habit and the practice of focusing on those negative emotions. And we want to build our awareness around that, because we get into a situation of a downward spiral. You've probably felt this before, where one thing goes wrong, the alarm clock doesn't go off, you spill your coffee, there's more traffic than expected, you're late to your first meeting, you're frustrated, it causes you to react more harshly to an email. And from there you say that sort of the day is lost. What we know is that we can quickly get on this downward spiral because of this attention and then habit of focusing on the negative. This is the negativity bias, and this has a very detrimental impact on our health and well-being. It actually has a diminishing effect on our health, meaning we have an increased heart rate, we have those increased hormones, cortisol, for example, we're in heightened alert, and that is like a lens that we put on to see the next event. So we're going into our next event with that negative lens. And over time, this stress actually diminishes our cognitive capacity. And we're not able to think as clearly, which in turn impacts our decision making. And as Emily spoke about, this has a massive impact on those around us in terms of the emotional contagion. As a leader, this is critical to understand, because our own well-being is impacted, but that it's also the ripple effect that we have on others. We bring everyone down in terms of that downward spiral. So we know this, and we've probably spoken about the downward spiral. Many of us are aware of this. We don't have the tools to necessarily get out of this spiral. And that's what resilience is about. The ability to foster positive emotions that allow us for a species survival, a long-term survival. And this is based on Barbara Fredrickson's work. She's created the broaden and build theory. And the idea is that as we have a downward spiral, positive emotions have a different utility. Positive emotions inspire different types of action. So when we feel gratitude, for example, we feel the need to give back. When we are inspired or feel awe, we are actually motivated to do more. When we feel joy, we're invigorated and motivated to act. And so positive emotions and the different emotions have different action responses to those emotions. And as we are able to increase those positive emotions, we actually have the opposite effect of negative emotions that narrow our visual field and allow us to survive that instant. And we're able to broaden our visual field so that we can take in more and have a long-term perspective. We're able to capture more signals from others. So not only words, but body language, nuances in terms of tone. We're able to really listen and capture what people are saying. So we broaden our visual field. And as we do that, we're able to build resources, different types of resources. So we're able to build our physical health. We're able to build social resources. As we broaden our visual field, we're able to connect better with others. As Emily spoke about, we have that mirroring effect. It's very powerful. So as a leader, if we are able to broaden our visual field, take in more, connect with people, they're going to mirror us, and then in turn have a positive emotion that comes from that connection. And that connection then allows for greater creativity in terms of hearing what is being said, in terms of building off of each other's ideas. And so through this broaden and build theory, we're able to use positive emotions to really transform how we see things, which lens we're putting on. And just as we put on a lens of negative emotions, if we're able to flip that and put on a positive emotion lens, we're able to see things in a different way. And by doing so, we're more open to others' ideas. We have greater empathy, and so we can take on more perspective to see from a different person's perspective, which drives creativity and innovation in terms of solutions, product engineering, different types of creative solution to problems. We're also able to learn, and learning creates many positive emotions, which in turn inspire us to continue on to build and learn further, and to give back in terms of our learning to share with others. And as we do this, we come into what is an upward spiral. Now, oftentimes, because of our negativity bias and focus on the negative, we're very aware of that downward spiral. Yet we hadn't stopped to think that there actually is an upward spiral. And this upward spiral has a major impact in terms of our own health, our own well-being, and the impact that it has on others. So the feelings and the emotions that are created in the leader are then felt in the team. So if the leader is in a positive place, is able to adapt their perspective and to create a positive response through mindfulness to a situation, that actually decreases negative emotions in their teams, in those around them, allows for greater appreciation of the message, really listening and processing. And in turn, that allows those people to then have greater capacity for positive emotions, to be able to process what is happening, and to be able to turn around and connect and create with others. So the positive upward spiral is critical for flourishing, and it's critical on a day-to-day basis, but in the current situation that we're living, we have to be aware of the focus, the heavy pull of the negativity bias to what is negative, and the anxiety and the negative emotions that produces. And by utilizing the information around the positivity, positive emotions in the upward spiral, we're able to gain a better sense of what is happening and to really foster those positive emotions. We typically say that for each negative emotion, as those negative emotions are so strong, we need at least 3 positive emotions to balance that, to get to parity. Yet Barbara Fredrickson's work in terms of the upward spiral says that in order to get to flourishing, we actually need a ratio of 3 positive emotions to every 1 negative emotion to allow us to have greater sense of empathy, to take on different perspectives, which allow greater connection with people, allow greater focus on others and listening, which allows greater connection and creativity, greater life satisfaction. And with those positive emotions, we can also then increase our cognitive functioning, which drives greater innovation. So the upward spiral is critical, and it builds upon the concept of increasing our positive emotions. So think of 2 levers that we have. And one lever where we typically focus is decreasing negative emotions. We often focus just on, we need to decrease our stress levels. We need to decrease our anxiety. We need to decrease those negative emotions that are pulling us down. Well, that one lever is critical, which allows us to build our awareness of those emotions, be able to sit with them. Like Emily spoke about, having some mild negative emotions can have positive drivers. What is critical to understand is sustained negative emotions and severe negative emotions have very detrimental impact on our health and well-being. They diminish that cognitive functioning, our ability to connect with others, and by diminishing that, it's much more difficult to have those positive emotions. So one way is to focus on minimizing some of those negative emotions. However, a more effective and efficient way is actually to focus on the positive emotions, because the absence of negative emotions isn't enough to have the benefits of those positive emotions. We actually need to have more positive emotions. So how can we increase our positive emotions? And it might sound quite simple, but it's actually quite difficult. And this is something we've discussed in preparing for this webinar, that everyone wants the quick fix. And actually with positive emotions, with mindfulness and resilience, there isn't a quick fix. Actually, the negativity is the quick fix, because it allows us to hyper attention and focus to make change quickly for that instant personal survival. And positive emotions are the long-term perspective, the ability to step back, to be in a good place that allows us to focus on others and be leaders that inspire others, be leaders that are able to think clearly, to make decisions, to really allow connection. And by doing so, the leader inspires that in their teams, so has a greater impact in terms of their ripple in their teams. And so when we think about how to go about this, it's actually quite difficult and requires constant focus. We need to retrain ourselves in where our attention goes, because our attention naturally is going to go to the negative, and even more so in the current situation we're living. So considering what we remember in the long term and where we're putting our attention and the emotions that we're getting from that is where we're putting our attention, we need to be focusing on highlighting the positive emotions. So one thing Emily mentioned was gratitude. And this is a great way to stop at one point in a day and say, what am I grateful for? I'm grateful for the fact that I can connect and speak about positive emotions on an individual level, but also in the workplace, and how important those positive emotions are in terms of creating a culture of creativity. We need to cultivate that habit of putting our attention on the positive emotions. So gratitude is a great one. Kindness is another. We typically don't talk about kindness in the workplace, but being kind to others. And what's really critical as well is finding your authentic self. Like Emily spoke about, faking it actually is detrimental to your personal health. So finding a way to build your mindfulness of those challenging emotions that you might be facing, create some distance, and consider how you're able to reappraise this situation, gain different perspectives, so that then you can communicate in a way that fosters positive emotions. Being kind to yourself is a great first step. Actually, it's very hard in different parts of the world. We find it hard to be kind to ourselves, but being kind to ourselves and compassionate with ourselves allows us great amounts of positive emotions, which then inspire giving back those positive emotions to others. So gratitude, kindness, compassion are all excellent ways to increase positive emotions. Finding the balance in terms of your authentic self is critical. And if we think about this, what we want to do as leaders is to really create the conditions for that positivity to flourish. So being able to come from a good place, being a place of well-being, being able to reappraise what the situation is, and to be able to foster positive emotions in ourselves, our communication, our decision-making is critical to creating an environment of positivity within the workplace. And within that environment of positivity, our teams are able to then better manage their own emotions, are able to communicate more clearly, are able to think critically and make decisions that are going to have a long-term impact, and are able to gain that perspective and be empathetic with others, and in turn be kind and other focused. So we want to challenge you to really consider how you're going to develop those positive emotions, how you can foster your own personal well-being, recognizing that the leader's well-being is critical to the positivity and success of the team, and recognizing that massive impact that leaders have on their capacity to impact positively, this greater connection with their teams, with each individual, that fosters creativity, and then that long-term resilience, which allows us to move on that upward spiral. And as we do, we're able to create a buffer and space in terms of recognizing those negative emotions and the impact that they have, and not letting us slip so quickly towards that negativity bias. So thank you, Rob. That's the end. I'd be happy to answer any questions or to dig deeper if there are specifics. I know we're limited on time.
Yeah. Thank you, Emily and Lisa, very much. I've written, you both are oozing with positivity and upward spiraling. I appreciate that. I've written at least 10 Post-it things for myself to put on my bathroom mirror at home as your personal quotes from both of you. So thank you. It is very inspiring. And yet, what we've done is we said this before, we'd like to have some inputs from two people, commentators. We have Doris. Doris is based, I think she's in Ghana. And Doris is a leadership expert, and she also is a contributor and a lecturer in some of our programs. And we reached out to Doris before and asked her if she would be willing to share with us. And we also have Torsten Kurting. Torsten is also a lecturer for CEIBS, a senior lecturer, and he's an entrepreneur, and he's based in Germany. And we're going to ask them just for a quick comment. And again, I've asked Torsten especially to put on his challenger hat, not a critical hat, but a challenger hat. Doris, would you like to share a minute or two about your thoughts and your responses to Emily and to Lisa?
Definitely, Rob. And let me say hello to everyone on the call. Like most people on the call, as was confirmed through the survey, we mostly have well-being as an important thing on our agenda. And for me in particular, it hasn't always been like this. And I used to go by the mantle that there's more rest after death. But then I, earlier on, started having recurrent symptoms of malaria. So tiredness, bodily pains, lots of discomfort, aches. And at that point in my life, I used to commute to work through the public transport. And in our part of the world here in Accra, Ghana, along the equator, we don't have a very good mass transit system. And so sometimes I have to be up as early as 4 a.m. trying to catch a vehicle to the office because I didn't want to be late. But fast forward, having had a couple of sessions with my doctor would often say, I should just take a break, I should take some days off, so we'll run all the tests and no pathogens are found, and I'm giving some 3 days to go and rest. And I actually recover. And I hope that this resonates with people on the call. And that was the point when I realized that my well-being was important, to the point where today, as we speak, I run a well-being company and I do a lot of coaching session on lifestyle for well-being for my clients. As well as I'm actually presently in my 2nd week on the Yale course on the science of happiness. So these are realities, and I don't have to pay a dime for that program. The thoughts that I want to quickly share are around the fact that our well-being is very critical to us, especially in times like this. And when I look at the well-being of the leader, I don't only look at it in terms of the corporate leader or the leader of a team, but I would like to come from seeing yourself as a leader. Everyone on this call is that leader, and you are the leader of yourself first. And I think the most difficult person to lead usually is ourselves. Because, you know, when you throw commands and instructions to someone, you can insist and ensure that they follow through, whether they are happy to do it or not. But when it comes to ourselves, we have the choice, we have the free will. And so we may desire and set certain plans, but carrying through with what we actually need or desire to do takes a lot of discipline. And I think self-leadership and discipline are what are going to be very crucial and critical in these times of great change. My personal observation is that in times of change like this, there's a lot of demand on us physically and emotionally. And you need your body to have a certain level of resilience in order to be able to withstand all the challenges that is going on around you. And to be able to achieve that, you need your immune system to have a certain boost. Your central nervous system should have a certain boost. And all these are actually possible only when you cater to your well-being in the areas that Prof. Emily eloquently articulated, in the area of physical exercise, hydration, nutrition, and rest. And then, of course, being positive. And on the aspect of positive, I would like to say that it's important that we see our ability to trust our gut feeling also as an aspect of positivity. Having that firm conviction that that which you believe, if you move into action on it, it's actually going to end out well, because sometimes it is our fear of the outcomes, our negativity, that puts us in a mode of inertia. So my encouragement will be in this time when we have to do, if you like, the resets and there's all sorts of pressures all around us. The positive side of this COVID-19 outbreak is the fact that it's caused all of us to slow down a little bit, which naturally augurs well for our well-being. And then a lot of us are working remotely, and we have to be mindful that since we can't get up to the coffee machine or to be beckoned by a colleague, we need to consciously set time to intentionally get up, stretch, and exercise so we keep our circulation in good mood. I think my concluding remarks would be in the area of how we can actually unleash performance for our team members as well as ourselves, where we lead family members or teams in the business setting. And it is the fact that we ought to empathize. I think it's been shared by most speakers on the call. We need to show our human side, be vulnerable, as we saw exhibited by the Marriott CEO. Let's show our humanity to our team members. And while we empathize with them, let's not forget to communicate the key expectations on outcomes. So long as we are clear on the outcomes, it's okay to just give them room and trust them to operate and to deliver on the results. I also personally have resolved that it's the time to work really smart. In our part of the world, we don't have 4G, we don't have 5G, we are on 3G. And that can be a bit frustrating when you are working remotely. But I think we can use the opportunity on this side of the continent to actually learn more about technology, to invest in technology, to use it, and to encourage our team members as well to use it. And then we should have our continuity plans in place and just trust our instincts that everything is going to be fine on the positive side.
I'm going to ask you to stop here so that because we're running out of time and we still want another commentator to give some of their thoughts. But I like your thoughts and your comments about us being human, and the idea that being human in different parts of the world has different meanings. I'm sitting in Switzerland with 5G and the infrastructure, the best infrastructure in the world. You're sitting with 3G and struggling with infrastructure. So yeah, being human means something different in different places. But thank you very much for your inputs. Torsten, I'd like to turn it over to you and ask you for a short comment on your side and a short challenge back to us.
I will do so. Thank you, Rob, for this opportunity. And I've got the evidence for you, yes, Lisa and Emily, for my post-it notes. This was, I must say, outstanding what you guys delivered, because usually it's just, I must say, theoretical, what you guys are trying to get out of us. But at this point in time, I must say, we are on a perfect downward spiral in what we're currently seeing in the world. Last week, we had 23 countries in this webinar with about 270 participants.
26.
And now there are 6 countries, maybe, I don't know.
No, 26 last week, yeah.
26, 26, I'm sorry about this. So, and each of these countries, they're in the different phase of that downward spiral that we're currently seeing. And I think that the big challenge that we all have, as it's not just this downward spiral, but the impact that the corona crisis has on all of us in many areas, where we understand that our substance is nothing worth anymore from one day to the other, where our momentum is dramatically stopped from one day to the other because the whole economy is currently collapsing, and the belief in ourselves as well as in our teams is fractured at the moment. So what we need is exactly what you guys are saying, and maybe you can give us some more impulses how to turn that downward spiral in that upward spiral, especially when we do not have the opportunity to connect with our teams in the way anymore as we used to. They're all sitting at homes, and I must admit that in Germany, we might have a great infrastructure. We have broadband and all this. However, there are many, many companies out there that have never applied home office abilities to their employees. So they're sitting at home, they're frustrated. We say alcoholism is rising up. The häusliche Gewalt, I don't know the English term for this, you know, when there is some fights at home are increasing. Oh, yeah. So what we desperately need is exactly what you said. And maybe, and if I throw in a question, a challenging one, what can we apply today? What can we apply right now and tomorrow? All of the 160 that are currently participating in that call to turn our downward spiral in an upward spiral.
Thank you, Torsten. Thanks a lot. Lisa, would you have any direct response to this question about how do we turn this?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you, Torsten. And thank you for your comments. First of all, I think knowledge is critical. Awareness of ourselves, where we're at. So where we're at today is key. Understanding the content, the research behind, and then recognizing that we have choice, that we don't have choice over being on lockdown. Each country is different. We don't have choice over the coronavirus. Acceptance is critical. And then deciding what we want to take choice over. So how we're going to live this time. I think a great question that we could ask ourselves is, where do you want, what is your story in the future? What story you're going to say that you did during the coronavirus times? And that can be really motivating. I mean, do you want to say, well, I don't really know. I, was on my news feed and played video games. Or do you want to say, I took the time to really reconnect with my family. I took the time to set up my home office, because actually the future of work is moving that way. And we will, and this situation we're living is going to accelerate that. And oftentimes when we're heavy in the negative emotions, when we're on that downward spiral, that seems impossible to do. And so going back to the basics, as Emily said, and Doris as well, sleep, eating healthy, fueling our bodies is critical. And then really putting our attention on the positive emotions is critical. So starting with one day, what are we grateful for today? What is the top today? And then sharing that, connecting with people. When you connect with people, yes, in person is better than online, but at the moment online is what we have, and fabulous that we are able to connect like this. So when you connect, that creates positive emotion. And then you look to link those positive emotions going forward. So I could go on and on. So I will stop there. I hope that answers the questions for the moment.
I'm cognizant of time. We're just a second over the hour. I know some of the people on the call have other commitments. I'd like to continue the call for those who can stay on the call for another 5 or 7 minutes, if that's okay. Also to you, Emily, and to Lisa.
Great.
Emily, I do have a question to you that came through the Q&A. You talked a lot about being an authentic leader, and someone has asked the question, what do authentic leaders do that others don't?
Okay, thank you. It's a great question. It's a big question, but I'll try and tackle it as succinctly as possible. So the thing is that authentic leaders, if you look at the science behind it, there's essentially 4 components to it. And arguably the biggest one is this idea that you have to have a very strong internalized moral grounding. So you have to know what your values are, what your priorities are, and always kind of keep moving towards that target, even if the means to the end change, as they're probably doing right now in the current crisis. So once you have that, once you kind of get into some of the self-awareness, like what Lisa was mentioning, understanding kind of your own emotions, understanding your strengths and weaknesses, from there you can start to go outwards. So then you get into something called balance processing, which is asking for diverse different points of view. So that way you can kind of benchmark yourself. You have that good understanding of your values and yourself. How do other people feel? So that way I can find a way to really relate to them, which is the final part, relational transparency. Because authentic leadership isn't just about saying and doing whatever you want all the time. But rather it's having a real acute understanding of other people and of yourself, and being able to show that true part of yourself that really is going to resonate with that other person, with that follower that you're engaging with. And so we all have very complex identities, and we all have different parts of ourselves. So really kind of having that good understanding of those things that are most valuable, that you can't compromise on, but also the ways that you can relate to other people. I think that's the best way. And I saw actually this morning, if you want more resources on this, Wharton's Adam Grant just today on his podcast released a whole talk on authenticity and then how it can be a little bit dynamic, so that you don't always have to stay the same person that you always were. But I think that those are the central components of actually doing authentic leadership.
I like that. Thank you. That's great. We have a bunch of questions coming in. I'm going to just pull out a couple and just get you to answer. One particularly, Jean-Baptiste has asked the question, as we're working remotely, how can we connect with our team and share positive emotions? Lisa, you want to take a stab at that one?
Great. Okay, thank you. I think the first step is gaining perspective. We feel that we're disadvantaged by working remotely. When we actually take ownership for that and say, hey, we're working remotely, and isn't that great that we can still connect? It inspires us, number one. So ownership is critical. Number two, we can really build on our strengths. There's a great framework called appreciative inquiry, if you're interested, to consider what is it that we do well, starting off. So what is it that we do well? If we connected well as a team before, well, let's build on that connecting well, even though we're in a remote environment. And the next, and I won't go into too much of the framework, but the next is to dream and say, well, what would be the vision of ideal? And then from that, you design how to get there. So some ways that teams, remote teams, work well together is that they have a connection time. So I know Rob's team, I think you have a wellness check-in every morning to see how people are doing and to just check in. How are we doing physically because of this time in pandemic? How are we doing emotionally, mentally? And it's a way to be really vulnerable and real and connect around that. That's one way. Another way is to build on your strengths and to really spot strengths in others. So to say, you know, that was really kind of you to offer to help your colleague who's struggling in this time because of the technology, for example. So giving compliments is a great way to connect with someone, and kindness is like a power-packed positive emotion because you get the positive, the benefits of that positive emotion, and the other who receives it also, and they in turn are inspired to be kind to someone else. So that's another way. And then finally, really recognize and embrace this humanness that we're in. So you get to know your colleagues a little bit better. You're seeing them in their home offices or their home space with the dog barking, with the child coming in. You can continue to celebrate birthdays, to share, you know, what is it that you're grateful for today, or what is something positive that has come from this. And so take the ownership and then create some vision of what you want to be, build on your own strengths, build on the team strengths. And I think a great way is really complimenting people on their strengths. That's a great way that inspires others. So great question. Thank you.
Great, thanks. The, you know, we keep coming back to the current state that we're in. In fact, that's why we've launched these webinars. And again, the overall title is Lessons for Leaders from the Crisis, right? It's what are we learning out of this, through this, out of this, because of this, et cetera. So, and so there's one question that comes up that I think, again, we've got many questions that we could be answering, but I think one that is very pertinent is, and it goes back to some of the comments that Emily, you made, was about, you said the word about recovery times, you called them recovery vacations. And one, it says, the question says, the recovery vacations and the breaks sound great, but I'm stuck in my house and I'm tied to my phone. How can I psychologically distance myself from all of this, from the work?
Okay, yeah, fair enough. I thought that might come up. I even kind of scolded myself, and I wasn't going to say vacations, but it came out anyway. But there's a lot of stuff that we can do. So I didn't have a lot of time to get into it, but there's other ways to kind of replenish our energy. So things like novel experiences can also be restorative. So probably for the first week or so, for many of us, working from home actually was a novel experience. And then, you know, it kind of quickly wore off. So I think that you need to do some of the things I already talked about in terms of using those breaks wisely. But also it's really important, I think, to create zones and to create boundaries within your house. So that way you can kind of psychologically and physically make this space happen. So some ways I see, you know, people doing this is having a very frank chat with your team, saying this is the time of day when I have the most energy or whenever I don't have family obligations, and blocking times off on the calendar, you know, when you're on an essentially do not call kind of list. Some people are blocking off different rooms for different kinds of activities, so the TV room might be just only for leisure. And we know from science on sleeping studies that this can be really helpful. This is why they say don't watch TV whenever you're in bed, because that's going to inhibit or keep your mind a little bit active. So keeping separate spaces, I think can be really helpful. I actually talked to an executive at Nissan today, and she told me that they're actually thinking of repurposing cars based on this whole epidemic, because so many people are finding refuge in their cars as their, kind of a safe space to escape whenever we don't have these typical outlets that we have. And I love Lisa's point earlier, and just saying that social activity is not done. So we call it social distancing, but it is really just physical distancing. And we know from the literature that these more richer means of communication, so things like video chatting, real-time communication, those kinds of mediums have a stronger component. So you want to build in with your team, for example, these wellness checks, or even just a coffee hour, a happy hour, something that you make rules where you don't talk about anything to do with work. And again, you get that psychological distance, so people can feel a little bit more human again.
That's great. That's really good. I'd like to close, because we are running out of time, with a question to both of you. And it's a personal question. Lisa, I'll start with Lisa, flipping back and forth. Lisa, how do you personally engage with the things that you're talking about right now in your family, in your home? What have you found at home for you are the most, and Emily, this is your question too, but I'm going to pop it on Lisa first. What are the things that you found really personally to be the most effective, and also the most challenging at the same time?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, because the science behind it sounds so simple, but actually creating these positive habits is challenging. And when you find yourself, as someone has mentioned here, when your leaders are in that dark space and they're faking it, or when we're really on that downward spiral, it's grim, and it can be challenging to feel that we have the capacity to do something about it. And so I think the greatest focus is to start small, and to, again, take ownership and try to focus that light on the positive emotions. We often focus on the fix it, the deficit. I'm feeling horrible, I have to minimize this. Whereas if we flip it and gain perspective, let's focus on what do we have. And so for me, focusing on health at this moment is really critical. Health in the embodied sense of physical, mental, and emotional health, and setting up positive routines that allow that to flourish in myself and in others. So I one night stayed up and on looking at the phone and then slept horribly, the numbers, etc. And so I committed to myself to not do that anymore. And I have small children, so getting them to bed, going to bed thereafter, getting up early, keeping in that healthy routine. I struggle with getting exercise. I'm based in Madrid, Spain, so we're actually not able to leave the house. So getting outside when the sun is in the small garden, really important. So just spending time outside. And then creating gratitude and looking for those positive emotions. So considering with my children, what are you grateful for? And they're little, so they're grateful for the doctors and for the food that we have. It's great. I also connect with my parents in California every day. I know that means so much to them. And so sometimes I'm exhausted, but I will connect with them every single day. And I've built some small things into our daily lives to make sure that we're on track and keeping those positive emotions going.
Thank you for your vulnerability and the personalness of that answer. Emily?
Okay, I think it's a great answer. It's hard to follow up on that. I'd really like to echo a lot of the things that I think are so important that Lisa mentioned. This idea that negative emotions can really grab hold of us and not let go. So putting in the work, and it is work, to, you know, put those positive habits in place every single day. And so I was spending hours in the beginning just reading everything I could do and looking at the statistics even, to, you know, to try and gain a sense of control over the negative news. So now I can, right when I wake up, I have 10 minutes, I can, you know, check all the numbers in the news, and then I don't let myself kind of look at it for the rest of the day. And something else that I found has been really positive is not just kind of focusing on gratitude for the things we still have, but really kind of challenging myself to creatively think of, okay, well, what does this give us that we couldn't do before? And so just this past weekend, it was my husband's birthday, and we've been, you know, kind of expats for over 10 years now. But the silver lining of this is that everyone around the world is stuck at home. So I was able to make like a Zoom surprise party for him, and we reconnected with people that, you know, we haven't talked to since college or high school even, you know what I mean? So it was a great opportunity that no one would ever have made time for before, you know, this obscure person, you know, from 10 years ago. So I think, you know, and I hear a lot of different stories from other people doing the same, like finally tiling their bathroom, or finally realizing how toxic this one coworker was, or, you know, like little things that I think that we're given as little gifts, and that if we focus on that, then that can make it a little more empowering and a little bit more bearable.
Thank you. Thanks. That's great. That's a great way to end. I'd like to say to Professor David, to Emily, thank you. Lisa Bevill in Madrid, thank you very much. Doris in Ghana, and Accra, thank you very much. And Torsten in Germany, thanks for all being a part of this, for the encouragements, for the positive thoughts. There's some Q&As that we have that I'd like to come back to you, Emily and Lisa, on. Maybe we could answer those virtually and then provide them as maybe some written responses to some of these, if you would be willing to do that, because we couldn't get to all of the questions. But we found last week, that was a good takeaway for people to actually read later, if you would be willing to do that. So, and to you participants, not still 130 people on the line, thank you very much for your time. I hope that this was an encouraging, motivational push for all of you in your lives, and to bring it back to the ground level of at home. Be safe, be smart, and hope to see you next week in our next webinar. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Rob. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.